I'm going to show you samples of different types of budgets with the intention of focusing finally on a sources and uses budget, which is what is required by most grantors today. For the county grant programs, it is what we require, that you do a sources and uses budget. And I will be able to differentiate for you between a sources and uses budget, an expense and revenue budget, and a simple line item budget. Invariably, people not familiar with sources and uses budget tend to think of budgets like they do their own family budgets, if they do one. All right? And so people tend to think of simply listing all their expenses, and then in terms of an expense and revenue, listing all their expenses, and then listing how much money they have, and then bemoaning the shortfalls. All right? But a sources and uses budget is meant to convey a number of things. It's meant to identify where every single line item funding comes from. That's what makes it a bit complex, right? Every single line item in terms of expenditure and revenue must have an identifiable source. So let's say, for example, your telephone bill for the organization is $400 per month. Not only must you identify in a sources and uses budget where that $400 is coming from, right? You have to identify that it is a need, but you need to tell us which one of your funding sources that's going to be drawn from. Or you may spread it across, of course, multiple funding sources. But in order to get a better sense of what that budget looks like, I want to talk a bit about what a budget is. From a public administration, public policy standpoint, a budget, in my thinking, is first and foremost a policy statement. The budget states where the priorities of the organization lies. And this is especially true of public agencies like Contra Costa County. If you say, for example, you have a value as an organization for women's services, but then your budget does not provide any specific allocations for that, then that claim of a value is a farce, right? We simply have to put our money where our mouths are, right? And that's how it becomes a policy statement. A budget, when we look at it, tells us where the values actually lie. If a public agency's budget prioritizes their prison operations, it means that incarceration is a priority for them. You didn't like that, right? But it is the truth, right? The budget indicates where the priorities actually lie. So what then is a budget? Well, it is simply a prediction of the costs associated with the program, right? A prediction of the costs associated with the program, and it covers a particular period of time. Most budgets are for a fiscal year. That said, the fiscal year for most organizations that are state and county begins on July 1st of one year, one calendar year, and ends on June 30th of the next calendar year. The federal budget cycle, I believe, begins, is it October or September? October 1, right? And that runs until September 30th, the next calendar year. Occasionally, there are organizations, and they're few and far in between, where their fiscal year coincides with the calendar year, which means their fiscal year begins on June 1 and ends on December 31st, right? Now, when we talk about what the budget is, it's an operating plan. It looks at what the financial reporting mechanism for the organization looks like. And again, it's an estimate of what you will need. So why do we even bother with budgets? Why are they so important? Number one, they really are an operations guide. It tells us what we can and what we cannot do based on our current financial situation, right? There are often things that come up that may be important, but if it's not budgeted and we don't have the revenue to do it, then it's hard to pull that off. Budgets are also planning tools. They help us to plan ahead in terms of what we will accomplish. So the District 5 budget for Contra Costa County, right, and our Keller budget was planned ahead to include what we're doing here today. right? We couldn't just come up and figure out where all the money would come from, and I won't bore you with the cost, but it's not cheap to pull off these types of activities. It takes a lot of time, effort, planning, and there are costs associated with it, but we plan for it, right? We budget it so that we can actually make it happen. But budgets are also management tools, all right? It's interesting, the average manager in most of our county departments have no financial background, no financial training. Why is that? Because we promote people generally based on their education, and we promote people based on their particular discipline. So we take a good social worker, and we make that social worker a social work manager. And then we take a good social work manager and we make them a deputy director. Then we take a good deputy director who was a social work manager, and we make them a director. And they have an MSW. They may have passed the LCSW exam, and they're clinicians, and they're very good at being clinicians, but they know nothing about budgets. They learn as they go along. When I do leadership seminars, I talk about the fact that one of the things we do in a lot of organizations is that we take perfectly competent people and promote them into incompetence. All right? And that's not meant to be cruel. We just take a person who is very good at something, we figure, well, if they're good at client work, then they must be a good manager too. Not so. That's not the way it works. So budgets now become a tool for these individuals to manage their programs. It gives them a chance to at least present what they'd like to do in terms of finances, but it also imposes restrictions on them and sets parameters as to what they can and what they cannot do. That's important. Budgets are also a communication tool. One of the good things of blending a dual career, 19 years with Contra Costa County, 20 years with the university, is that I lean to strengthen each of them with the other one, right? And for one of my healthcare classes, public finance, healthcare finance management and third-party payer systems, I have our students reach out and pull Contra Costa Health Budget, the largest department in the county. They pull the health department budget and do analysis on it. Right? So it becomes a real practical kind of experience. And as they're looking at this, I said, what exactly does the budget tell you? All right? And one of my students was really very startled. She said, wait a minute, most of the health department money comes from grants. I said, uh-huh. That's a communications tool. It's telling you what the source of revenue is. Where you have a large organization like Contra Costa Health with roughly 80% of its money coming from grant programs. See, people don't know that though. But budgets communicate important bits of information. And budgets also identify where our policy priorities lie. They're policy tools. They're saying this is what we want to do, this is what we don't want to do. Financial control and budgets are also a contract. So let's talk about some of the very common language. And I'm going to assume that you do not have an MBA. I'm going to assume that you're not a certified public accountant. So I'm going to give you some very basic language used in budgeting, at least from the perspective of a grant writer. So let's talk about these. Let's look at the first one, revenue. When we talk about revenue, we're actually talking about income that is generated from a variety of sources that are appropriated in this budget document for the purpose of paying expenses. Right? So that's our revenue. How much money we take in. And when we talk about expenses, we're talking about the inverse of that. Those are the costs that are incurred by the program, and you draw money from this revenue line to take care of those costs. The next one I want to talk about, I mentioned this morning, and that has to do with in-kind services. This is critical. In-kind is critical for the budget that is called a sources and uses budget. Now, let me tell you this. Remember we said every part of the proposal informs the other? If your logic model was well done, it will help you figure out your in-kind very quickly. If your logic model did not have all the details, now you've got to scratch your head and figure out what the in-kind elements are. because all the in-kind should already be listed as an input in the logic model. See what I mean? Each contributes to the other. That's an important thing, right? So when we talk about in-kind, we're really talking about non-cash revenue, right? Non-cash revenue. As I mentioned this morning, when you're looking at non-cash revenue, it can be revenue that comes in or something that comes in the form of a person volunteering their time. But as I pointed out then, when you're identifying the value of time donated to your organization as in kind, it must be based on what is being delivered, not the person's capacity or what they bring otherwise. So if you have a retired physician who is a receptionist for your program on a voluntary basis, the value of their work from a budgeting standpoint is what you would pay a receptionist, not a physician. Right? So that's important to sort of keep in mind when we talk about our budgeting. We talked about matching funds this morning. Funds, so I won't spend much time on that. But I want to talk about these other two because, and by the way, this came from the Grantsmanship Center. I put the source on there so you can go read more. I want to talk about direct costs and indirect costs because this has been a source of interesting confusion over the years as we've looked at budgets. So when we talk about direct costs, we're really just talking about all the costs that can be traced directly to the operation of the program you're seeking to have funded. Indirect costs, however, are ancillary costs or shared costs with maybe other elements in the organization. Let me give you an example. Let's suppose you work for the RISE Center, right, in West County. And the RISE Center, let's say they have 3 programs that are funded by 3 different grants, and they have more, by the way. I'm just giving you an example. But the organization has 1 executive director, right? So an indirect cost would be the executive director's time because that person has general oversight for the entire RISE Center, and so you could make a case that a little part of that person's salary could be drawn from each of those grant programs. Another indirect cost might be shared utilities in a building, right, where you have electricity. You can't separate the electricity of one program from another one. You're all in the same space. So the electricity can be identified as a shared cost, and so that becomes indirect. Things like insurance, and I don't mean health insurance for personnel. I'm talking about property insurance, facility insurance. Those are some of the things that could be considered indirect costs and shared costs. Think of indirect costs as infrastructure costs and direct costs as program operations costs. I'm trying to keep this simple. Tell me you're still with me. Yes. Hallelujah. All right. Okay. So then, indirect versus direct costs. And there's a reason why this is important because in every budget you do for a grant program, you will have to include direct versus indirect costs categorically. And you'll see what I mean in a moment when I show you a sample of that budget, right? A couple more things about budgets that you need to know in terms of the language. Operating expense, right? The operating expense is a category of expenses that does not include necessarily personnel costs, but it includes other operations that keep the program actually running, right? So important one to know. Budget justification, In a sources and uses budget, every line item must have a separate description telling what that line item is. That's called a budget justification or a budget narrative, right? Let me explain what I mean. You can have a line item in a budget that says, under personnel costs, you can have a line item budget that says 2.0 FTE for staff, but there are actually 4 people working. Your budget narrative or justification would have a sentence that say 4 employees, each working at half-time equivalent. It explains the line item because you can't write all of that in a spreadsheet cell or a table. So the budget narrative explains each line item. And yes, that is required as accompanying a sources and uses budget, right? There's another one which you may or may not have to use. It's called units of service, and that is the approximate costs incurred when you take a particular service and divide it into units. I'll give you an example. Let's say, for example, you operate a shelter, right? A small shelter that houses no more than 50 individuals, okay? And the question is, what is the cost for one bed night? That's a unit of service. A unit of service would be the cost to have one person stay one night. And it's not as easy as just taking the whole expense and dividing it by 50. I wish it were that easy to determine what the cost per unit is. Why is this important? In our Keller Canyon grant program, we've had people come in and ask for maybe $10,000, and we said, we can do 8. And we often say to them, how many units of service will that get us? That's different from the 10,000 that you requested. Grantors do that. We want to know if we scale it down rather than saying no altogether, that there's still a certain number of units of service you will provide. You need to walk into those interviews ready to say, well, for $10,000, we would have been able to serve 100 people. But for $8,000, we think we can serve maybe 85. Based on this cost per unit of service. Why is it complicated to calculate? Because there are certain cost elements in the operation of a program that are fixed costs regardless of the number of people you serve. But there are some costs that are variable. Here's the deal. Once we're running these lights, whether it's 5 people in this room or 100 people in this room, the electricity costs the same. It's a fixed cost. You follow? Yes. So then you need to keep all of that in mind as you're trying to calculate the cost per unit of service and back out those fixed costs first. Right? Think of it another way. If you work for the school district and you have to pay a teacher, whether 10 kids come to school that day or 25 kids come to school that day and they get all of what ADA is allowable, you still got to pay the teacher the same salary. You still have to light the school facility the same way. You still have to pay the principal and the counselors the same way. And that is something we don't think about. Those are not variable costs. They're fixed, regardless of the number of people served. So that's why this section here is really important, understanding cost per unit of service. So these are the general categories you'll find in just about every major budget. I've listed them here for you. Personnel. That's one major cost. And by the way, for human service organizations, this is generally the largest cost center. Microphone, please. Right in the back. And I'll keep talking while he gets the microphone or she gets the microphone over to you. So personnel will be probably the largest cost center. And then, of course, benefits are also quite costly. Now, if you work for a public agency, the benefits are the next biggest cost. I remember when I worked for the city of Oakland back then, and by the way, keep in mind, this is over 25 years ago. The cost for benefits was 50 cents on every dollar. You said, ouch. My understanding is that now it's about 70 cents on every dollar. Higher than that? Good Lord. And if it's one of those high-risk organizations like law enforcement and fire, it is even higher. Yes.
Perfect. I wanted to go back to what you were saying about if just in case if an organization or a funding partner cannot fund the whole thing right off the bat, and maybe it's like maybe $10,000 or a little bit less. Keeping that in mind, if for example I'm going to be doing a presentation next week, would I just have to look to see if like I would have to do the program that I'm implementing like maybe a couple times per week?
Yes, you can. Okay. You can always just scale down the implementation plan to do less of what you're doing. But that assumes that the costs that you are going to, the savings you're going to realize are in fact from cost adjustable items. If it is, then yeah. Right? Let's say, for example, you are leasing a place and it's a per use base where you have to pay to have something at a center. And if you go one time, you pay less than if you go 2 times, then yeah, you can simply do it that way. That's easier. But if it's a fixed cost, a fixed lease cost, for example, then it's not that easy to do that, to scale it down. here's the thing I've discovered. Sometimes nonprofit organizations that are looking for grant money get very desperate, and so they're saying, I better say yes or else. I'm going to take this money even though what is offered to me cannot reasonably implement the program. I would say it is better to defer implementation of a program until other grant sources are identified rather than do one that you, pardon the colloquialism, screw up. Because getting out from under that reputation is no easy task. All right, thank you, I appreciate your question. Okay, all right. So back to these categories, we have personnel, benefits, supplies, equipment, and by the way, supplies, equipment, travel, those can all come under direct costs, right? Or they could also come under operating costs, depending on how the budget is written categorically. And then, of course, you have those indirect costs. Let me just say this. Most organizations have what is called an approved indirect cost rate that the organization's finance people have worked out in advance. And it's usually based on a percentage of a grant. So they may say, for example, that our indirect cost rate is 15 or 20% of the value of the grant. The problem is the organization's indirect cost rate may not align with the allowance of the grantor, particularly if it's the federal government, who has had for many, many years an unrealistic indirect cost rate that it would pay, right? Most realistically speaking, it's not enough to cover. So something to sort of keep in mind as you're developing that piece, right? And there we go again, that logic model. Because that logic model is going to help you contribute information to the budget. Remember we said all those inputs you listed? Well, that's where the logic model is going to come in. I see a hand in the back, right? I don't want to spend a lot of time on the logic model anymore because I think we did enough, but it helps you to really figure out what you need to do. I see a hand in the back. Go ahead.
So back to what you were saying about the indirect costs and the direct costs. Mm-hmm. In a situation where you have established your budget, but in the process of implementing your program, you come across obstacles that affect, meaning like your indirect cost aren't enough based on what you budgeted, but you have direct costs that you didn't even utilize. You thought you were going to need it, and you ended up not using it.
No.
Grants?
You cannot automatically transfer.
You can't automatically, but do the funders provide a process? Or
very often they do.
Okay.
But I can tell you, generally speaking, particularly government funders have indirect cost rates that they don't allow you to go above. Grantors usually say, we allow an indirect cost rate of 15%. If you take the grant, you need to figure out where to make up the shortfall. All right? So, and you generally cannot transfer between categories. It means you can't go between direct costs and indirect costs, or you can't go, because indirect costs are not line itemized. It's one category. Right? So there's no indirect cost for the executive director, indirect cost for the PG&E bill, none of that. It's just one flat rate indirect cost. So shifting it around will simply mean move from one category into this other category. They don't typically do that.
Okay, and then my last question would be, in a situation where, let's say that happened, and of course, like you said, you can't move from direct to indirect. If at the end of your grant and you're giving your summative evaluation and you say, you know, we budgeted for travel as a direct cost and realized we were able to do this without incurring any of those expenses, what would happen to the money that was given to us for that line item if we didn't use it? Do we have to give it back to the funder? What happens?
Well, your question has an assumption in it that the funder gives you the money up front.
Oh, okay, true.
And that is not the case.
You have to invoice.
Yeah, most of them are what we call cost reimbursable.
Okay.
You are notified that you have the award, and your organization typically goes and spends from the general fund and then gets reimbursement up to the amount granted. Now, there are some foundations that will give you some money up front, but public agencies, Contra Costa County doesn't like to do that. There's a provision where they will allow you, if you're an organization operating below a revenue threshold of getting 50% up front. But most people don't know about it, so most people don't ask for it. But it can be done, all right? But again, it won't be for an organization that operates on $10 million a year. But if you're a smaller nonprofit with a $100,000 budget, there is a process for requesting 50% up front. Here's the catch, though. When you get that 50% up front, you cannot get any more until you provide receipts showing that that 50% up front has been exhausted already. So it's still cost reimbursable in that respect, but at least you get something to start with, right? Other than that, if you're a larger organization, the expectation is that you will spend the money up front. And again, that's where you borrow from your general fund and then get reimbursement. And a lot of foundations do that too. And the reason for it is that people sometimes get the money up front and they go away. They go to Bora Bora. They go to Timbuktu. They go to Trinidad for Carnival, and then spend the money. And we've had that happen in Contra Costa County. People got the money and took off, and we didn't see them. So that is why the auditor controller is very, very cautious about giving money in advance. And a fair concern, right? A fair concern. Right. So now let's quickly talk about the types of budgets that we're talking about here. The most common, probably one of the common ones, will be a line item budget. We talked about a revenue expense budget, and we're going to talk now about each of these quickly. The line item budget. And I took an actual organization and created essentially 3 of the budget types to show you what they look like. So you will notice that personnel is the first category listed, followed by the benefits. And the benefit rate will vary by organization as a percentage. And then you have the first direct category, salary and benefits, $91,000. Everything else falls into operating expenses, right? And those operating expenses which are total direct costs, equal, including the personnel and the operating expenses, the total direct cost is $97,000. The indirect cost rate here is 10%, $9,700, total budget, $106,700. Really just a line item. It doesn't say anything but where money comes from. It just says this is what this costs. There's a coordinator for 1 FTE, right? But we don't know if that's one person. But here's something interesting. What do you notice about the second line item under personnel? The word. Look at the word. What does it say? Mentors. Mentors, plural. Did you notice that? But it says 1 FTE. That is a cue to me that it's more than one person comprising that 1 FTE. But this type of budget doesn't show that in any way, right? Of course, a budget narrative can always kind of justify that a little bit. So this is a line item budget, and this is what is hardly ever used. Nobody wants it. It won't work like that. Now there's a revenue and expense budget. The revenue and expense budget is an expansion of the line item budget, because what it does is that it essentially lists all the revenue that you're going to get, and the expenses are still listed separately. But at least it tells you where the revenue is coming from. It says the Department of Justice for this particular grant is providing $80,000. The Wine 8 Soda Foundation has been requested to provide $25,000. It means this grant is not approved. It's pending, right? And there's a fraternity that has contributed $1,700. So the total projected revenue is $106,700, with 25% of that being actually tentative. We don't know for sure, right? Then we have the expenses below, listed much the way they're listed on the other line item budget. Now, this is what the sources and uses budget looks like. And here's the difference. The sources and uses budget identifies all the same line items and all the same funders, but it also tells you to what source each line item is charged. That's the difference. And this is really important, the difference to note. If you notice that when we look at the coordinator, right? When we look at the coordinator, the position costs $40,000, and all of the coordinator's position is funded with the DOJ money. Do you see that? Right here. But then mentor at $30,000, $15,000 is funded by the DOJ and $15,000 by the Y&H Soda Foundation. So it tells you where the mentor money is coming from. And then it tells you how the benefits are split as well, how the salaries are split between the DOJ and the Y&H Soda Foundation. Now, in terms of operating expense, they include office lease here, and the DOJ is going to put out $1,500 towards the office expense, the lease, and the Y&H Soda $2,500. You can see that. Now, you can see that $1,200 that came from the fraternity is going particularly to equipment. That tells me something. That tells me it's restricted money. It means the fraternity likely donated that money specifically to purchase some equipment, right? And in the world of accounting, by the way, restricted dollars, it is illegal for a nonprofit to take money that's been designated by the donor for a particular purpose and use it for another. Be very aware of that. Right? If a person says to you, I'm donating $1,200 for you to pay for that copy machine, that's all you can do with it, nothing else. Right? And if you can't use it for that, you need to return it to the donor. Right? So this is essentially how different this is. This is how different this is. It shows every category. Look at, by the way, the indirect costs. Do you see how it's spread across all of these programs here? A sources and uses budget will tell us in no uncertain terms where all the money is coming from. Now, let's say you come to apply to Keller for money, and we're looking at this as your sources and uses budget, and you've asked us for money to pay for, let's say you've asked us for money to pay for the office lease. And we are just not inclined, I'm not saying this is the case, but I'm giving you an example. We're just not inclined to pay for office lease. That's not what we want to fund. We can say to you, would it be possible for you to request one of the other organizations to cover your office lease, you know, and we will cover something else, another line item. We maybe can cover your telephone expenditure. We maybe can cover part of your benefits. This is what we actually cover. This sources and uses budget gives us the opportunity to focus on the specifics of how each line item is funded and how you're spending each funding source's money. That's the major difference. Questions everywhere. Let's hear them. They're coming around.
I just have a question about, say, like equipment. If some organization, the fraternity gives you, I don't know, a copy machine, and can you put that down? They don't actually give you money, but they actually give you the copy machine.
Yes, and I'll come to that next in a moment. That's in kind. And so there is another line item as a funding source that should appear here. They just don't have it in this one. So DOJ, Y&H Soda Foundation, Omega Psi Phi Fraternity, and you can also have one that says in kind as a source. And you begin to put. So let's say you have in kind, and for equipment, you have somebody who donated a machine that's worth $1,500. Then you simply put that $1,500 right there under in kind as the funding source. But it has to be accounted for. Right? Under personnel, you have a volunteer receptionist. That person goes under there. You put the value of the service they're providing, and you put that under in kind as the funding source. Does that make sense? Thank you for raising it. All right, next.
So this budget seems very kind of simple and straightforward. It's not multiple line items of costs and not multiple funders. Say you had individual donors, and foundations, and government funding. Like
you can categorize individual donors.
But this could be quite long.
Yes, it could be.
Yeah.
I'm afraid it could be, yes.
But
you can take all, let's say you have multiple major donors, right? You can just create a single category called major donors, not each individual donor.
Okay.
And draw from that.
Mike, I have a question just around your comment earlier around when a person is wanting to apply for, or organization is applying for a grant and they may not have multiple sources. Does that then look bad to the grantor?
It can,
Okay.
depending on the program, but it's more of a liability if your program is a new one and doesn't have experience in the field.
So there's just no way around it. It's like a catch-22.
Not necessarily. Select a fiscal agent that has more experience in the space and you become a subcontractor.
Okay.
We've had that done. We've had that done several times over the years for Keller. Individuals who just started a service and they don't have a nonprofit designation yet. All right, and so they go and they ask an established nonprofit, would you be our fiscal agent? And so the contract then is with the nonprofit that's the fiscal agent, and they pass on the funds to you to do what they need to do. They often take a fee for that, but that's a possibility. Yes, please, go ahead.
Yes, I really appreciate this workshop, and it's extremely informative and very helpful. My question would be, if a nonprofit organization does not have, or they don't have anyone with the expertise and skills to apply for grants, how does this organization handle paying a grant writer? And where would that follow in the budget?
Let me just answer this by saying this. There is not a single grantor I know, government or private sector, that allows you to pay a consultant, that is a grant writer, with grant funds.
Okay.
I don't know of any. I've never known of any, right? They expect that you will have to find that resource elsewhere.
Okay, thank you.
Who's next? Right over here, please.
I just want to say, for the organizations that have all volunteer workers, you have to really count the donations that they make to your organization.
Yes, you
We
do.
used to not even include in the in-kind list how much time we put in and how much that time cost, and we just recently calculated it. Our budget increased from like $10,000 of getting grant funding to $250,000 a year was what our expense was, but $177,000 of that was volunteer hours contributed. And that's, grantors will see that and say, you guys have dedicated people, and we'll fund you because you have so much time invested in this, because time is money, right?
That's
and the
right.
other thing is that for those of you who don't have professional grant writers, I've been attending this course since 2015 when he first presented it, and we started with mediocre quality grants. Now we're close to exceptional, and this because I've been, attending these classes. I've encouraged a lot of our board members to come and attend the classes too, so they can know the headaches that I've been going through for the past 8 years. But attending classes like this, there's even courses online that you can register for. TechSoup.org offers grant writing courses. You can you can attend those online. But anything you can do to increase your knowledge in grant writing is good. You will get something out of it. You may not get $10,000 the first time. We didn't. We got $4,000. But that's more money than we've ever received from grant writing. And we keep getting more and more because of classes like this, and initiative from other people will say, well, how about this grant? Apply for this. We get a lot of no's. We get some yeses, and you just learn from that.
Thank you very much. Supervisor has a meeting coming up, and so I'll ask her to make her closing remarks because it is 4:30-ish.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I have a meeting to jump on Zoom to meet with our superintendent and the county supervisor, but I just want you all to give Dr. David Fraser a round of applause. So you guys didn't know you was coming to school today, huh? Well, this workshop been amazing, and it was the goal of just making sure that our smaller nonprofits are educated. I think the most important thing we know is knowledge is power, and this is how we move forward. So I would suggest you all, before you leave this afternoon, almost evening, to make sure you pass your business cards around.
Yeah.
Meet with people, connect with people, as Dr. David Fraser was just sharing, like collaboration. If you can't do a grant alone, doesn't mean you can't get the grant. You collaborate with someone so you can get the grant.
Yeah.
Partnerships, build relationships. We can't do it alone. Just think, if we do it together, how much bigger, how many more people in our community that we can serve. So that's what we have to think about. I was talking to one of our service club groups during lunch, and she was sharing just with everything that's going on a national level, sometimes it makes you feel like, why am I still doing this work, right? And so she was like, she was inspired to know when I said, because we can't do it, because government can't fill in all the gaps. You all, each and every one of you here is filling in gaps that we cannot fill in. So that's why we need you all to continue to pounding the pavement, to continue to serve the people in our community. I think just listening to issues today, we talked about homelessness or unhoused, our youth, sex health education, mental health services, housing, our veterans and how we serve them with suicide prevention, food insecurity, literacy for our youth. I can go on and on. All of these things matter, and there's plenty of issues out there to work on. So don't feel like it's just this my issue and you be territorial. We can't be like that. We gotta work together. When you're applying for grants, just know that my office, I can write a letter of support. So definitely if it's a state or federal grant, I can help support that. So please contact the office for a letter of support. If it's a grant that's like a Keller grant or a Los Angeles Healthcare Advisory District grant, I cannot write a letter of support for those two because I oversee those. So.
Right.
And then I just want to thank Contra Costa TV
Yes,
and our
CCTV.
county staff with our tech support Joe here. The Ambrose Center, and then everybody on my team for all their work. They got here at 7 a.m. to make sure they pulled off this event for you all today. So, and then lastly, just give yourself a round of applause for hanging in there all day to get all this good information. I hope you all are able to share it. As Dr. David Fraser shared, it is being videoed, so we'll make sure to put this in our newsletter. And we'll also share it on social media as well, and just share it with your community so they'll know. So thank you again. You all have a good afternoon, evening.
And by the way, let's not forget that you will receive a certificate of attendance from the Board of Supervisors, signed off by Supervisor Chanel Scales Preston. So those will be mailed out to you. Make sure if you did not, when you did your registration, provide the information. By the way, it's a beautiful certificate, and you know, I think it's going to be good for you to have. So just kind of keep that in mind.
Thank you.